The Pennsylvania primary election is upcoming May 18th, and voters across the Commonwealth will be deciding if they want to amend the state's constitution. 4 ballot questions face our voters. What are they? What do they mean? And what effects will they have on the Constitution and our everyday lives? Sarah Anne Hughes of Spotlight, PA sits down with us next. All that is coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. May 18th is the Pennsylvania primary for 2021, and along with statewide judicial races and local races, voters across our Commonwealth will be deciding on a series of ballot questions, including 3 amendments to the state's constitution. What are those questions? What do they mean for us? We're joined tonight by Sarah Anne Hughes. She's the deputy editor of Spotlight, PA, and has been covering this story. Sarah, welcome to Face the Issues.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And before we get started, Spotlight PA is a somewhat newer organization. Could you just tell our viewers what Spotlight PA is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Spotlight PA launched in late 2019 to cover stories of statewide importance and also to act as a watchdog and write accountability stories about our state government in Harrisburg.
Yeah, and just for full disclosure to our viewers, I do serve with Spotlight PA's diverse source database, which is a privilege and honor to do that, but always trying to be completely honest and give full disclosure to our viewers. So Sarah, let's get started. 4 questions coming up on the ballot, 3 general areas. The first one that's probably gotten the most attention is dealing with the governor's emergency powers. We are obviously under 2 emergency declarations, one dealing with COVID-19, one dealing with the ongoing opioid crisis. The first 2 questions that voters will see will deal with these. What are those questions that they're going to be voting on?
Yeah, so both of these questions, as you said, deal with what's called a disaster declaration. So essentially, currently, the way it's set up is that a governor can issue a disaster declaration, and that activates a number of executive powers he has, right? It gives him more power to suspend regulations. It allows him to control travel. It allows him to use the National Guard in ways that he usually can't use. So we've been under a disaster declaration for COVID-19 for almost a year at this point. And so a governor essentially can declare a disaster declaration. It lasts 90 days, and then he can renew it as many times as he feels it's necessary. And so, over the past year, Governor Wolf and the State House and Senate, which are both controlled by Republicans, have clashed a number of times. Clash is probably too not strong enough a word, but they've clashed a number of times on the administration's approach to the pandemic, right? And we saw this really come to a head with the business closures and the pace at which the Wolf administration reopened the economy, with the Republican caucuses wanting to go much faster than that. So, this has been sort of a long time in the works, but essentially what these 2 ballot questions would do would be to transfer power from the executive to the legislative branch, right? So instead of the governor being able to renew a disaster declaration every 90 days, it would end after 21 days and would only be able to continue if the legislature, a simple majority of the legislature, votes and says yes. And that would be every 21 days, right? So that means that the legislature in this case would every 21 days have to come together and say, yes, we want to continue this. No, we don't want to. The other big change would be that the legislature at any point, even before 21 days, would be able to terminate a disaster declaration unilaterally. Now, this was a big deal last summer. The state constitution already says that if the legislature wants to end a disaster declaration, they can come together and pass what's called a concurrent resolution. They did that. There was then a dispute between the executive and the legislative about what happened next. The executive said, well, that has to come to me. I either get to veto it or sign it. And obviously I'm going to veto it. The legislature said, no, you don't get a say in this. It went to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court sided with Wolf. both vetoed it, and then the House and Senate weren't able to reach the 2/3 vote threshold required to overturn his veto. So that's a long way of saying that under our current system, the power to declare, to continue disaster declarations rests with the executive. If voters approve these two questions, it's a very large shift over to the legislative branch where they will essentially get much more control over this.
Okay, so there, to your point, there's been a big dispute between the executive and the legislative branch, between the Republican and Democrat Party on this one. And there's been some dispute over language as well. So just to clarify, right now, the governor has the authority to declare a disaster declaration. That ability to declare it is not going to be changed by either of these amendments. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so it comes down to then how long does that last in its initial declaration, and who gets to choose if they're going to extend it. And that seems to be where the debate is, if I'm understanding this correctly.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty simple issue on its face, right? Like, who should have this power? But I think where it becomes much, much, much more complicated is what happens if we would end a disaster declaration. That is really, there's two sort of disputes going on. One is about the language that's actually appearing on the ballot. So the way that this works is that the legislature passes basically a resolution that says we want something to this effect on the ballot. They pass it twice in 2 sessions, and then it goes to the Department of State, and they actually write the language to put it on the ballot. And the language that the Department of State wrote, the Republicans really hate. They say that it's written in such a way that's obviously made these questions designed to fail. I talked to a person from F&M College in Lancaster who writes poll questions. That's what he does for a job. And he essentially said, yeah, I agree with the Republicans on this. There's some loaded language in here. There's some terminology that's obviously meant to make voters think that this is a negative change. Mm-hmm. And that's really where the other sort of sticky point of this comes in. It's what happens, right? What happens if this passes and the legislature says no more disaster declaration for the pandemic? The Wolf administration says this essentially would be disastrous. We would potentially lose access to federal money. We would no longer be able to waive regulations like one that allows retired healthcare workers to be on the front lines right now. That there would be a number of big issues that if we ended this disaster declaration. But the one thing that the Wolf administration says this wouldn't do would be take away the executive's power to close businesses. That, they say, lies with the Secretary of Health and this thing called the Disease Prevention and Control Law, which is this ancient law which hasn't been updated in decades. And they say, you know what, do this if you want. It's not going to stop us from closing businesses if we need to. Republicans are saying, we think actually it would. If we went to court over this, we think we would win. But this, of course, puts voters in a terrible position, right? On you face, you sort of, what you're voting for, but the consequences of it are really, really murky. And if, this happens and we're, God forbid a pandemic happens again, I imagine that this would probably end up in court where we're trying to decide the actual effect of these ballot measures.
Sure. And to your point, Sarah, both sides, both the Governor Wolf and the Republicans have said this is not just about this administration and this pandemic. This is about the future. Both have made the argument. The governor saying in the future governors need this kind of power. The Republican legislators saying for the future, checks and balances need to be in place. And so they're both making that same appeal to future administrations. This is not a sports show, but if we're to ask you for a prediction, where do you think this is going to fall?
Well, Sam, I actually just want to, can I add one thing
yes,
to
please.
What you just said? So you're totally right? So we're talking about the pandemic, but we're in a hopefully once in a lifetime pandemic where this disaster declaration is being placed. But the executive declares disasters much more often than that, right? We use it if there's a flood. If there's a flood out in Western Pennsylvania and the governor needs to use that power. There are a lot less flashy reasons to use these disaster declarations. And I think that's a concern of the Wolf administration, right? Even when he leaves office in a year and a half, future governors are going to have to wrangle these 253 legislators, get them to vote every 21 days if, there's a natural disaster. And I think they're really, really concerned about that part of it. So whether this passes or not, I will say that when you look at the proposed constitutional amendments since the 1960s, when we had a constitutional convention sort of rewrote our Constitution, every single constitutional amendment has passed. We've never had one that hasn't passed, right? So the chances of this passing are pretty good. I think a lot of people see this as a referendum on the governor's response to the pandemic. I think a good amount of people are unhappy with the vaccine rollout, with some of the other approaches the administration has taken, and this might be their way of expressing that anger. Now, what that actually doesn't affect, right? Whether or not it would prevent the things people didn't like about the pandemic response. Most experts I'm saying to say no. This is a much more sort of technical thing than that. But yes, we've never seen a ballot measure not pass in this state.
Yeah, and to your point, this is not just about one governor. This is about governance in general. And so, Sarah, thank you for that breakdown. Don't go away. When we come back, we're going to address the other two questions that voters will see on their ballots. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Sarah, one of the other questions, constitutional amendments that we will be facing, our voters in this state will be facing, deals with race and ethnicity. Could you explain question 3 that we'll see on our ballots, what it is and what it's designed to do?
Yeah, so this is a much shorter ballot question. You'll see it essentially says, should the Constitution be amended to enshrine discrimination protections to individual Pennsylvanians based on race and ethnicity? So this was a proposal from Senator Vincent Hughes, a Democrat from Philadelphia, who essentially was looking at the racial justice protests last year and said, we need increased anti-discrimination protections based on race and ethnicity. So currently, there are many different levels of protections, discrimination protections for people based on race and ethnicity, right? You have the U.S. Constitution, you have parts of federal law. We also have a part of our Constitution in the state already that's focused on anti-discrimination when it comes to race. But essentially the argument here is that this gives the courts just even like one more measure to look at when looking at these, and knowing that the intent of the legislature is to not allow discrimination based on race and ethnicity. So seems fairly straightforward, very simple. It's not. I wish it was, but unfortunately it's not as simple as I thought it was when I first started reporting on this. So I should say that groups like the ACLU of Pennsylvania are in favor of this amendment. They essentially said what I just said, right? That we have this anti-discrimination protection in our state constitution already passed in the 60s when we were redoing our constitution. But this would basically give courts just something else to look at to know that this is not acceptable. Now, the League of Women Voters, in their voting guide, has sort of raised some red flags, some possible red flags about this, right? And I have to emphasize that we're operating in hypotheticals, right? It wouldn't be until we actually got into a court setting that we would know what would happen. But essentially, the League of Women Voters say in their voter guide that this change could possibly allow people to bring so-called reverse discrimination cases. Essentially, if a white contractor, right, came and said this state program that prioritizes minority-owned businesses owned by Black and brown people, this discriminates against me as a white person, and that this new part of the Constitution could potentially be used to bolster their case and to sort of give them a winning argument. I think there's also some concerns that this could be weaponized in such a way to do away with affirmative action, which we've seen in some other states. Now, again, this is a lawyer's opinion as expressed to the League of Women Voters. The ACLU has heard these arguments. They think that the pros outweigh the cons here, that the possible benefits outweigh why people should vote against this. But, I think it's just important for people to know that especially when we're amending the Constitution, which is a lengthy process and very hard to undo, that there can be unintended consequences, right? Something so well-intentioned can go wrong. And just to be aware that, that possibility has been raised in this case.
Sure, and we've certainly seen that with other laws in the past. I mean, think about South Dakota and even Pennsylvania with Marcy's Law that had unintended consequences that eventually got repealed or thrown out. Let me ask you this, Sarah. The governor's emergency powers was hotly debated between the parties. This passed with bipartisan support. Are there specific political groups out there that are opposed to it? Is this a Republican-Democrat come together moment, or is this something where one of the parties is more stringently opposed to it than another?
Well, the backstory to this amendment is not quite as kumbaya, not as come together as it seems. So essentially, Senator Hughes tacked this on to the disaster declaration amendments, right? They all got passed in the same resolution, but split into these 3 separate ballot questions to make it easier for voters to actually understand all these separate things they're supposed to be voting on. Now, Senator Hughes has said repeatedly that he introduced this because of the racial justice protests, because he thinks that this is something we need to do. There is an alternative theory that when you add things on to ballot questions, you can possibly violate something called the single subject rule in our state constitution, right? That's exactly the problem we ran into with Marcy's Law. Mm-hmm. So the voters passed Marcy's Law in Pennsylvania, but the reason it's not in effect is because it went to court, and essentially courts have so far sided with the argument that there's too many things in this one question, that voters couldn't possibly say yes or no because they were saying yes or no to multiple things. Mm-hmm. And so that was a possibility with this, right? That this could have been added in a way to make the disaster declaration more open to a court challenge. But as you said, when it came up for a vote, everybody initially voted yes on it because it hasn't been debated. These possible downsides that have been raised by the League of Women Voters, as well as by some chapters of the NAACP in the Philadelphia suburbs, weren't raised. I mean, and this brings up a really important point. There were no public hearings on any of these ballot questions. The legislature did not convene a panel of experts to hear pros and cons. So essentially, the floor debates that they had about that, which were pretty limited in this case, in the race and ethnicity case, that's what voters have, really, right? And then they have these opinions from outside groups, but they didn't get that opportunity to have these amendments vetted in a public sphere.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting and whether that's because of COVID-19 or just the hope of rushing these in before the election date, that's certainly an interesting thing. I'm glad you pointed that out. Sarah, don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Sarah, the last question I want to talk about is actually not a constitutional amendment. It's a referendum. And the referendum would allow for municipal fire departments or companies with paid personnel, as well as EMS companies, to apply for loans through an existing state-run program that exists for volunteer programs. That's a mouthful. First of all, why is this a referendum and not a constitutional amendment? And then secondly, of course, what does this do? What's the intent of this?
So it's a pretty basic difference, right? The constitutional amendments will amend the Constitution. This has nothing to do with the Constitution. It'll just change state law. It's a pretty rare tactic, from my understanding, to actually send a question like this that doesn't involve the Constitution to the voters. But for some reason, the legislature decided this is something that they wanted the public's input on, and so this is how they're getting it. Now, and of course, if any of your viewers know differently, they're more than welcome to email and yell at me. But I have not found objections to this ballot question. I think this is a pretty straightforward one. So we currently have a loan program that only volunteer fire departments can take part of. Now, the vast majority of our fire departments in the state are volunteer departments, but essentially the ones that have paid personnel and as well as EMS departments wanted the opportunity to apply for these loans which the money can be spent on renovating firehouses, on buying new equipment, just like the basics that these companies need. All of the major groups that represent firefighters in the state are very much for this. One thing it doesn't do is expand the amount of money that there is available for these loans, which, is a possible downside here, that it could take money away from volunteer departments that need it. But ultimately, it's pretty basic, right? It's just saying, should paid companies be able to take advantage of this loan program?
And in your article on this, you said the Pennsylvania Fire Emergency Services Institute, as well as the Pennsylvania Career Fire Chiefs Association, are both encouraging a yes vote on this. Are we hearing, and you said that there hasn't been any opposition to this, are we not hearing opposition from volunteer departments? Is that, because I imagine there could be an argument here for volunteer departments saying this could potentially take away funding from us.
Right.
Have we heard this? Have we not heard this?
No, we haven't heard that. We haven't heard that publicly from the companies. No, I mean this again, a possible downside. As with all of these, there are possible downsides. Sure. But this one seems to be, this is the one I truly really haven't heard any pushback to.
Yeah, I'm sure we won't see a unanimous vote because some people like to vote no for the sake of voting no. Let me ask you this about the fact that it's a referendum and not a constitutional amendment, which you explained earlier. This is something that still goes to the state legislature, right? So the state legislature brought this up, argued it. Was there a vote on this, and then they decided to put this out to the public? As you said, we generally, when we vote on something, it is a constitutional amendment. What was the process for this referendum, and do you know what their thinking was on why they wanted this to go to the public?
Yeah, I don't actually. I mean, the way it worked was exactly the traditional bill process, right? The House passed the bill unanimously, the Senate passed the bill unanimously, Wolf signed it. The bill does, has different components to it also about fire companies, but it has that one section that says referendum. We want to ask the voters if they want to do this. I haven't heard any reasoning from the bill sponsors why they wanted to send it to the voters. As you said, it's kind of a rare thing. I will say that in Pennsylvania, we don't have, like in some other states, a voter can't say, hey, I want to get a referendum on the ballot. And then they can go through a number of steps to actually do that. We don't have that here. So when there is a question about public support, this just is another valve for the legislature to sort of to gauge whether or not this is something that the public wants, because we don't have that other option of sort of the citizen-driven ballot initiative here.
And again, this may be more of an inside baseball question. It almost seems that, I mean, if it was a unanimous vote, it almost seems that the legislators putting this up for referendum know the way the public is going to go. I mean, is that almost redundant, or is that perhaps something where they do this because they know or think they know which way the public's going to go, and something more controversial, they may not put that up for referendum because of the unknown?
These are really great questions. If I could know the intentions of the General Assembly, I'd ask for a raise. Why they do some things, why this one, whether it was for sort of cover, whether it was, whether this particular loan program requires, the original loan program, the bond to actually pay for it, was also a referendum. That was in the 1970s, I believe. So there might be some reason that if that's connected to that, this has to go to the voters. But again, I haven't heard anything about that.
Sure. And I certainly won't ask if you know the legislators' intent in 1970s. I think that's a little bit before both of our times. And so, Sarah, let me, and I appreciate your insights. I appreciate you breaking this down. Obviously, very, very important. We don't just vote for candidates in some of these elections. These are times that we have a direct chance to vote on an issue itself. As you know, voting in midterm, or not midterm, in off-year elections, the turnout is much lower. We expect to see a plummet compared to last year's presidential elections. Wrapping up here, if you could give a message to Pennsylvania voters on why they should get out and vote in May, what would you tell them?
Well, first, I think it's really, really, this cannot be said enough. Independents and minor party voters can vote on this. There's this idea that only Democrats and Republicans can vote in Pennsylvania's primaries. That's true when it comes to the candidates, and we have some really important judicial candidates on the ballot. That's not true when it comes to ballot questions. These are so important. They, changing the Constitution is a very, very weighty decision. It is much more consequential than changing a law, which can be changed back pretty easily. And so I just truly could encourage every single registered voter to really do their homework on this, right? Visit the League of Women Voters, visit the ACLU, visit the Republican caucus, visit the Democratic caucus, read everything you can about these ballot questions because they're complex. And I know sometimes people go to the primary and they're surprised when they see these questions and like, oh no, what is this? But do your homework on this because I just can't stress enough how critical these constitutional amendments are for the state.
And if I can add to that, visit Spotlight PA and Sarah Anne Hughes' coverage on that. Sarah, thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
That is our show for tonight. I want to thank Sarah Anne Hughes for joining us. And a reminder to all of you to get out and vote May 18th, the primary election here in Pennsylvania. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.